Hello, everybody. This is Rob Fredette with the podcast HODGEPOD. Welcome. Another episode is on the docket for today. And I have a real special guest. All my guests are special, but I have a really special guest tonight. His name is Bernd Haber. He's the author of a book, and I'm going to let him tell the story because this is a fascinating story from World War II. So, first of all, Bernd, welcome to my podcast. I'm really honored that you have come on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, Rob. Really appreciate it. Yes.
Yes, sir. So I always like to have my guests introduce themselves. Number one, get a feel for who my guests are. So please, if you give a brief introduction, and then we'll talk about the book.
Sure. So my name is Bernd Haber. I'm a born German. I was born and grew up in Berlin. Actually, to be exact, I was raised and born in East Berlin. So I was born after the Berlin Wall was built. So I grew up in East Germany, went to school. My family lived in East Germany until, of course, November 1989, when the wall came down and another part of the whole world opened up for us, particularly for me. And a few years later, I applied for a job with an international consulting company, American company, and that brought me over to Phoenix, Arizona. And since 1996, I've been living in Phoenix, Arizona, beautiful state. You see the background picture, that's Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of water. A lot of people don't think there's a lot of water in Arizona, but there's good amount of water wherever you go. And of course, all the treasures, Arizona. So ever since more than 28 years now, I believe. Yeah. So that's how I ended up in Phoenix, Arizona. I've, in my life, done IT consulting, worked for large global corporations, software testing, quality assurance, but also I'm involved in music business. I started a company in 2003 called World Strings Promotion. But then, of course, I also always was interested in the history of my own family. So my father, my grandfather, who's the author of the diary that we're talking about. But then there's also many more stories to tell, related stories in the entire family. One story leads to the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. One of our family members was a member of the International Brigade, so it spreads out quite a bit.
Talk about, if you would, before we start talking about the book. I'm fascinated by history. I love reading history, and back in the 30s, 20s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And talk about the Berlin Wall after the Berlin Wall came down. What was it like, first of all, living in East Germany, and what was it like after the wall came down? I'm interested in your recollection.
It was, of course, quite a change for everybody. No one really expected it. So for someone living behind the Iron Curtain, so you only had exposure to so many things. But when the wall came down, of course, the world opened up. And my first trip, of course, was to West Berlin. I was on the east side, so, going underneath the wall with the subway. So it was my first experience. And I was still a music buff. So at the time, of course, you may record these big things called vinyl records.
Yeah, I do remember.
So I was a big fan of, and I had a few from like Beatles, Rolling Stones, but that was the first time I was able to go to a record store in West Berlin. And
wow,
you may recall every East German was considered brother or sister, kind of considered also a German overall, not just an East German. So every East German was allowed to go to the bank, get 100 Deutschmarks. They called it the welcome money, show your ID. And you get your 100 Deutschmarks for free. The first thing I did with the 100 Deutschmarks, I went to a record store and spent it all. So that was my first impression. But it was interesting for me to see the other side of Berlin, not so much West Germany. But it was much more colorful, of course, with all the ads. And yeah, I spent some good days exploring West Berlin for a while. And then, of course, West Germany, eventually France, the UK, and so on. And the big change for me was, of course, a new system came to us, right? So, for example, filing taxes, that was a total unknown for me. So, filling out this form and you could get money back. Oh, that's really cool. So stuff like this, it took probably 2-3 years to really get adapted to the new system that came to us.
I find that whole time period with the Berlin Wall coming down, it happened fast. It was like the way it came down. When you were living before the wall came down, was the Soviet Union pretty much occupying East Germany?
Yeah. So they had 500,000 soldiers. I'm not sure if that's well known. 500,000 soldiers stationed in East Germany with their tanks ready to, of course. I'm happy it never happened. It's ready basically to attack. So yes, they were occupying. Of course, there was the East German Communist Party ruling the country as one-party system, but it was always the Soviet Union, not dictating, but controlling pretty much the system. So
And
yeah.
one more question. Did you have family members on the West Germany side?
Not at the time. I didn't know at the time, but it turns out that my fourth cousin lived on the other side. We met actually here in Phoenix. We live maybe a mile from each other. We had no idea we exist. And it's been now more than 20 years since we met. And we had no idea we existed. So it was a whole nother part of the family. So it turns out our great-grandfathers were brothers. So yeah, I had family there, but I didn't know about it.
That is fascinating. When you said you lived in East Germany, on the eastern part of Berlin, I was just fascinated. I'm fascinated about that time when the wall came down. I went to the Ronald Reagan Library back in 2008, and they have a piece of the Berlin Wall at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Libraries. That was unbelievable. So let's talk about the book about your grandfather. He had a diary. I'll let you talk more about that. But it's Fritz Haber, The Complete Diary, 16 Months in American POW Camp. He had a diary, but I'm going to let you talk about that. So how did you come about finding out about that? And it's quite fascinating just what the story you're going to tell.
So since I mentioned that I was always interested in my family's history because there's, my father, his siblings, and also his parents and great parents. And in 1990, so throughout the 80s and 90s, so I was starting to really get into it. And in 1990, I reached out to my grandfather. So he's the father of my father, and said, I want to sit down with you. I'll come to you, travel to you. It's this little town in Saxony called Zwickau. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'll travel to you, to your place. I would like to interview you about my father. I was really interested in my father's story, when he was a boy. And so he said, yeah, come along. So we sat down, and luckily I recorded it on a cassette tape. Remember those little cassettes? Luckily I turned them on.
Yeah, we're going old school here.
Yes. So I have 3 hours of that interview. So we talked about family, all kinds of history. I learned quite a bit. I knew a few things, but I learned quite a bit. But in the middle of the interview, he said, oh, Bernd, did you actually know I have this diary here? So I wrote it when I came back from, the prisoner of war camp, sat down, wrote it down. Do you want to read it? So, of course. So I was allowed to take it home. I was in Berlin, took it home for a few weeks, but I had to give it back. So I, read it. It was fascinating in this original, beautiful, I don't know if you can see it on the book, you see that his handwriting in the back, very clear handwriting, beautiful, easy to read. It reads like a novel. So even you read it, your imagination is right there. So I read the diary, gave it back, took some notes, took some quotes down, and then the diary totally disappeared for years. And in 2020, I was visiting my dad, and he was 89 years old, and I could foresee very soon he may not be with us anymore. And then in April of 2020, he passed away. I visited him in Berlin and was very happy to spend the whole week with him, 24 hours, talk about his life, and took a lot of notes. And then he said, oh, Bernd, by the way, I have this diary from my father. Do you want it? Because I knew about it. I said, well, yeah, of course, I read it way back in 1990, but, forgot about it. No, of course, I remember. I'd love to. He said, you can have it, take it with you to Phoenix, and here's some other things you may want to have from your father, from me. So took it home. So I was looking at it saying, oh, this is great. What should I do with it? I could maybe publish it in a book, which is awesome. I can publish as is in German in Germany. Okay, that's an option. But then I realized I've been an immigrant to the United States for a good number of years, almost 30 years or 25 years at that point. So, because in conversations with my family, with a family and friends and circles, I realized that a lot of people know about, of course, World War II. They know about fascism, Hitler, and all of that. But pretty much all they know is Holocaust. It's World War II, D-Day, and a few other things that happened between 1933 and 1945. but that's pretty much it. I said, here's a story of a, very common, normal man, family man, nothing fancy. There's a few fancy things about him, but he sits down, writes down his experiences being captured by the American troops in 1945 in April, sent to an American POW camp in France. So he did not end up, some people always ask, did he end up at a POW camp in the United States? The answer is no. He ended up in Metz in France for 16 months. And then he sat down with everything that he experienced, and just fascinating, and then also he was a member of the Communist Party, which is an interesting fact. So in 1933, he became a member of the Communist Party, and then he had to serve in the Wehrmacht, in the German army eventually. So it's kind of a conflict, but of course he didn't have a chance to say no. But that's a conflict by itself in his life.
So I'm looking at some pictures here of in his younger days, and those pictures look exactly like pictures I see to my grandparents and my parents growing up. Just the family together, everybody in the picture. And his war is horrible, but everybody is a family. There are pictures in, like these pictures here.
And there's an interesting story. So my grandfather always, well, let me take a step back. So if you look at his life, he was born in 1910. So if you go back in history, German history, that means there was still the German Empire. So they had an emperor, right? Ruling the country. So 1910, then 1914, 1918, World War I happened, right? That got rid of, I say it like this, the empire. So then the Weimar Republic started, 1920s, the good old days kind of thing in Berlin and everywhere there. But then 1933, Hitler took over. Next 12 years, fascism, Nazism, war, World War II. So he's lived through all of this. And then 1945, the war ends. 1946, he returns home to Saxony, which then became part of East Germany. There's two Germanys coming out of all of this. So he ends up living in East Germany, of course, still with his communist vision of this is now the better society. In 1950s, he gets in trouble because of a shooting that took place during World War II. And then he lives all the way through 1989 when the Berlin Wall comes down. And then he experienced also the reunited Germany. And he passes away in 1998, I believe. So he went through 5 or 6 German, stages, so to speak, in his life. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, talk about his experience as a POW, but what was it like going back to Germany after World War II with the Soviet occupation? Did the Soviets pretty much have East Germany or East Berlin at that time?
So they won the war by conquering Berlin, the final battle, right? But then, of course, over the next, actually before the end of the war, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill had met before, right, in 1943 in Yalta, and these 2 or 3 conferences in Tehran, I believe. And they already divided Germany at that time. So if we, beat Hitler and his armies, then here's how we split the whole thing. So that's what happened. So of course, Berlin was split in 4 occupied zones, but in Germany as well. It was an interesting, not a fun fact, but an interesting fact. The city of Zwickau, where my grandfather lived, and his 6 children at the time, my dad and his mom, were first occupied by the Americans. So the Americans moved into Zwickau, occupied the city for probably a few weeks. And then because of some negotiation in other parts of Germany, they retreated, and then the Soviet army moved in. That was, just an interesting fact about that location.
That's fascinating. So talk about your grandfather. He was captured, American POW. So what was that like when you were going through the diary? What was it like, and how was he treated, and what was his recollections? Because he obviously had an unbelievable diary.
Yeah, so April 29, that was the day when he was captured. So luckily for him, he did not end up at the Eastern Front fighting the Soviet Union. Otherwise, he probably would not have survived the war. He was stationed near Munich in a anti-aircraft searchlight unit. So he was those big lights looking for the aircrafts to shoot down. So because of that, he was alive. And it was a small little town near Munich, and they saw the American tanks coming down the hill on the other side of town. So they had their white flag ready. And he said, well, I'm wearing the uniform. I'm not ashamed. But then what he does, he makes breakfast for everyone. So once in the morning, he said, let's make breakfast. So he knew, of course, the local farmers. We have some eggs, we have some bread. Everyone sit down because we do not know when the next time is we get food. So he makes breakfast, and then Americans come and they capture them and then put them on trucks and then carry them away to camps, in a sense, where they all, bring together all the German soldiers and then send them off to various locations. So he, of course, in the first few weeks, it was terrible because it was April, May, it was still cold, rainy, not much food in those camps, not much water. They had to fight for water a lot. So it wasn't really clear for him if he would survive. And then he describes in one of the scenes, they are all on a truck, on the back of a truck, open truck. And then the two American soldiers have a, big bag of sugar, but they pour it out in the open instead of giving that to, the prisoners. But then the Germans, they drive through these various villages, and some of the German farmers or people who live there try to throw bread towards the trucks. So overall, I would say in summary, they were treated okay by the Americans. So there was no mistreatment overall. It was more between the German soldiers. Of course, the same ranks played a role because the Americans said, hey, officers and the senior soldiers, you control the other soldiers. So there was the same rank establishment within the camps where the officers had the saying. And sometimes, of course, that led to some clashes. It took him, a few weeks and months to really survive until he really ended up in that camp in Metz, which was then okay. It was good food, normal food, and, water and some coffee. And they had to work, of course, during the day. But overall, the treatment was okay. There was not, at least in the diary, no mentioning of any mistreatment by the soldiers, by the American soldiers. Yeah.
Did he ever say anything about the United States, I guess, capturing them? I guess that would, or versus the Soviet Union. Did he ever talk about that?
So they talk about the soldiers, among the soldiers in all the German soldiers. So there's 4 or 5 categories of soldiers that he met. So I take you back a little bit in terms of how he grew up. So in the 1920s, his parents were quite open-minded. So they had 4 different newspapers at home, a very conservative, a little bit less conservative, a little bit more progressive, and the left-wing communist newspapers. So he could read all these newspapers, the various points of view of the world. So he was well educated how the Weimar Republic worked. So from that perspective, he was clear at that time that Germany had lost the war. It was clear to him, and here's why. And in the book, he describes what happened until Hitler came to power and why. So he does some analysis of it. So from his perspective, it was clear. But other soldiers in the camp, they totally were lost. They're still, in their mind saying, we didn't lose the war. So it's just a moment of time, and hopefully they treat us well here. Or some soldiers had the perception they're not treated well, or they had the expectation, well, we're prisoners of war, they need to treat us well. And among those discussions, some people were pointing out, you're lucky that you're here in an American camp and not a Russian camp, because that would be the Gulag kind of way back in Siberia. So they had these discussions. He never compared them directly, but among those conversations, it came up. Yes.
Did he have a specific job or a task while he was a POW? Because I find that to be, I think that was one of his duties there. Did he have something into that effect?
Yeah, so in the 1920s, when he was a young man, he had an apprenticeship as a blacksmith. So he became a blacksmith by trade, and he had his jobs throughout the 20s and 1930s, but that was his trade. So yeah, while he was in camp, the Americans said, yeah, you need to fix our cars or anything we need to get fixed because you're a blacksmith. So that was his job, basically, in the camp.
Mm-hmm. How has the book been received since it came out in 2024? Because this is an unbelievable historical look back at World War II.
Yeah. So I get feedback from various, I've had readings within my own family. My wife has a book club. We had a reading there and get interesting perspectives of, I did not know that the personal story can tell so much about the World War II and German history, I have been in contact with, for example, Vietnam veterans groups who have invited me to come to a meeting in October and have a conversation about the perspective World War II, Vietnam War. I've got feedback from various readers who said it's just a compelling, amazing story of one person, a normal person. And he uses the line, how human destinies can get easily mixed up. That's one of his quotes. To deal with it and then to survive in this case and then finally get and have the faith to get back home. So yeah, there's various aspects of people who want to read the book. So a compelling story, having faith, being strong about eventually make it home. And other people say, well, it's a great also history book because it gives me the history of how World War II started and ended, of course. So yeah, very positive.
So when you were reading through the diary, through that first or second read through it, was there something that you did not know about your grandfather that really like said, wow?
Yeah, there's one story. So there's a mentioning in the book a little bit, but I have a separate documentation where he wrote down all the details of that story. So picture this, it's, I think, February 1945. It's a few weeks before the end of the war, and everyone feels it's going to end soon. There's something, it's going to end. So they have these conversations among the soldiers. Of course, you have to be careful. So in February of 45, his commanding officers calls him into his office and said, Fritz, I have bad news for you. You need to report 2 days from now near Munich, near Dachau, in a town, to so-called field court. So Feldgericht, that's the German word. So that's a court-martial unit in the field at the front line. And they would prosecute or persecute anyone who tries to run away, deserters or who steals food. And it's war, right? So, or anyone who says something bad about the war or about Germany. So my grandfather, so what's the reason? Well, someone snitched on you. What? Okay. Well, you have to go. It's an order. You have to go. So he jumps on his bicycle, drives to the village, meets the farmers first, and then he reports to the next morning to the Feldgericht. So they tell him to sit down. And you just picture this. So there's these men, very serious faces. It's like the Supreme Court. There's a very, like Robson, very serious. And you knew as a person, if you end up in front of a field court or Feldgericht, that's pretty much the end of your life. Whatever the charge is, they may just execute you in the afternoon because the charges could be so strong. There's no chance you would. He had this expectation. So he goes into the room. He said, sit down. We have 2 questions for you. So soldier so-and-so told us that you said something bad about the war, about Germany. And picture this. You're in this moment, you think you're going to get shot 2 hours from our next half an hour, right? In his mind, immediately he snaps saying, oh, wait a second. Yeah, I remember him. Well, the guy was a drunk. He was an alcoholic. We shared a cigarette. We talked about family, but he was an alcoholic. So I don't think you should really believe what he said. But I remember the conversation. All I said and all I was saying was quoting the Minister of Propaganda, Mr. Goebbels. There was this newspaper I read, and there was this headline, and he was quoted saying, who will believe it or not, Mr. Goebbels said, in order to win the war, we need to conquer Ukraine. So I'll leave it at that. So he said that to the field court, and he said, oh, you just quoted the minister. Okay, then we're good. All right. One more second question. Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And he said, no, absolutely not, even though he was. So just imagine they had all the paperwork with them at the time, but it was, 45. Europe was destroyed. There was no way to get his paperwork from Zwickau to Munich. So luckily for him, they didn't have any paperwork. And he said, no. They said, okay, thank you very much, dismissed.
Wow.
So he leaves and then comes back to his unit, and his commanding officer said, oh, you're still alive? Wow, tell me about it. And then they were laughing. He said, well, we need to have a drink. So yeah, that's one of these episodes. He mentioned that in the book a little bit. There's a little bit more to it. So yeah, I learned about that quite a bit, about that story. And then there's another story. It's related to my father. So, and I can show the website address later. So if you go to the website, so there's a section called called the interview. There's 3 photos do you see there? And when you click on each of these photos, you can hear my grandfather talk about a certain episode in his life, and you can turn on closed captioning to read it in English. And that's from the 1990 interview. So that's his voice in these stories. And there's the second one, where there's a family picture if you click on it. So he tells how he got a letter from the POW camp in France back home to Zwickau. So his family knew he's alive because, 6 kids at home. They had no idea for about a year where he is, if he's still alive. So he gets a letter home. Basically, he talks to an American journalist who visits the camp and says, hey, you mind taking this letter back to Munich? You need to go to this church, find this minister. His name is Huber. Give him a letter. He knows me. Huber will send it home. Can you imagine for a moment saying, hey, Mr. American journalist, go to New York City, go to this church, find this person. It's 1945 or 1946, and give him the letter and send it home. And sure enough, the letter made it home after a few weeks. And in return, weeks later, he gets a letter back to his camp, finally from his family. Hey, we're so happy you're alive. And in this letter, my father, he was a 15-year-old boy, asked my grandfather, or his father, the question, what should I become in life, Dad? I have 3 choices. Okay. So in the letter, he says, I have 3 choices. I could become a miner. Zwickau is very known for coal mining. Mm-hmm. Do you think I should become a miner? Second, I have a choice. My teacher in school told me I'm really good at acting. Should I become an actor? The third choice is someone told me, the local newspaper, told me I'm pretty good with the German language. So I wrote a few things for them. They think I'm quite talented. So my grandfather, in his return, in his letter back home, he tells my dad, miner, no way. Your brothers are all miners, but you're not miner, period. Acting, forget it. You need to become a writer or journalist. Go for it. So my dad then, of course, works for the local newspaper and eventually ends up in Berlin for his political career. In January of 2020, when I went back home to visit my dad for the last time, I asked my dad, so do you remember sending this letter or these questions to your dad? He said, yeah, somehow I totally forgot about it. Yeah. So what did he write? So I was able to quote him from the letter saying, here's what he told you to become a journalist. And then he sat down and cried, my dad. So I was able, to close that loophole for him before he passed away.
That is a fascinating story. I have a book endorsement here from Born Krondorfer, and it is a rare that we have access to the thinking of German communists who find themselves serving in Hitler's army and after the war return to East Germany to seek rehabilitation by the German communist government. The diaries of Fritz Haber, written when he was a POW in an American camp, open a rare window into such a life. Those diaries found their way into the hands of his grandson, Bernd's with me right now, who had grown up in East Berlin and now resides here in the U.S., a must-read for anyone interested in the myriad ways of ordinary people resist and get implicated in dictatorial regimes. And that last sentence really resonated with me about the regimes. That was quite an endorsement.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I'm very happy and very proud that Björn Krondorfer, who is the director of the Martin Springer Institute at the Northern Arizona University, to have also written the foreword in the book. And what he reflects on, and I'm very happy that he did, is the generations after any war, but in my case, after World War II, that of course, surviving the war is one thing, coming home, and then family members would ask you, so tell me about what happened the last 4 years. And most of them would say, don't want to talk about it. Nope. They ended up in a camp or whatever experience they had during the war. They said, I don't want to talk about it. To write it down. No, I don't want to write it down. So many of the next generation, like my dad's generation, they would not hear from their parents what happened. No conversation whatsoever. And then Björn in his forward also pointed out, so then the third generation, which is me in this case, finally was able to open up with the grandparents, because there was enough time in between what happened and having that conversation and sit down. So let's talk about it. It's not about a judgment or whatever you did. You tell me what you want to tell me. But then in my case, in 1990, my grandfather opened up. So that I was very lucky that in my family, my grandfather and then my father told me a few things. And then my great grandmother, so Fritz's mother, I have her diary as well, her origin diary. So I could put all the pieces together, family history with his diary as well. So I'm very lucky about that.
The website is 16 months as POW.com. Bernd was referring to that a few moments ago. So it's 16 months as POW.com. So what else? I don't want to give away too much about the book. So what did your grandfather do in his later years after the war and he got acclimated back into society? I know he went to East Berlin, but what was that like moving on after World War II?
So for him, he returned back home to Zwickau, and then first he started working as a miner again, but only for a few years, because in the 1950s, there's another story. I give you a little teaser of that. When he was in the Wehrmacht serving during the war, he was ordered one day to become a member of the shooting squad. So there was, and it's not clear, was it someone who tried to desert at the time during war or someone who stole a loaf of bread? It's not 100% clear. But he was ordered. Of course, you cannot say no. So you come with me, line up 35 soldiers, and there's the guy, tied to a pole with what's it called in front of his eyes?
Oh, blinds.
Blind, yeah. And then boom, right? So he was a member of that shooting squad and was the only person he ever killed. So in that sense, lucky. But in the 1950s, there was some delegation from another country, I think from France, came to Saxony, and some person of that delegation pointed at him. So he murdered somebody, I know. So then he got in trouble with the Communist Party because he thought, growing up or being now in East Germany, being a member of the Communist Party, it was the better society. Now we do it, right? And then here he gets in trouble again because someone pointed at him. He was a murderer. He killed someone. And the party members, basically they kicked him out of the Communist Party because of that. So therefore, it was another struggle for him to realize, here's where I live. This is what I expect from society. And here I'm getting betrayed in a sense. So, and that caused a lot of trouble for him. And at the time, my dad, his son, was in Berlin making it up in a political career in a party. And so he tried to resolve it with my dad. It didn't really work out at the time. And so over the years, he worked in a brewery for many years. He was in a mine back and forth. Like in the 20s, he had many, many jobs for a few years, but he never really recovered from that incident in the 1950s to be really fully acknowledged with the members of the party and in the unions. So he lived his life, of course, had, kids and grandkids, but he struggled until 1989. And then there was for him also mentally another, I should not say breakdown, but a realization to figure out, so what's the right answer for a society? So reunified Germany, capitalism takes over again. So he struggled then.
Yeah. Going through this, it must have been traumatic for him in some sense.
Yes, it was. And then, of course, like any family, there's always drama, right? With the siblings and the sisters and the sons and the grandkids. So that, of course, is part of normal life. But it was traumatizing for him, having this expectation, I live in a better society, and then they just kick him out. And he never got recovered from that. Only after his death, he wrote a lot of letters, and eventually they said, we're sorry. After reunification, it took a few years. I think he got the letter when he was still alive, but still, it was way too late for him. Yes.
Well, it's amazing when you have governments, communist countries, it's the people are just like us here in the States. It's the governments that get in the way of the people living, normal lives. That when you look back, at certain instances today or back then, it's, people are just normal, like family pictures here. You had family pictures of your grandfather that looked like family pictures here from the 1920s and 30s in the United States. Exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, from that perspective, it's a very interesting life to go through in a diary when he writes about his life in the 20s when he became an apprentice, become a blacksmith. And then so going back to the website, there is I think the first picture when you click on it. So he tells the story how much money he made per hour. And then at the end of the year, he gets his bonus from the master, from the Meister. And he comes home with, was it 75 marks? So you know, picture for a moment, 75 bucks.
Mm-hmm.
You make maybe 50 cents an hour or $1 an hour, but then the bonus 75 marks. And so he talks about, so he goes home, puts the money on the table for his parents, saying, we're really rich now. Oh my God. So stuff like this. And that's the 1920s after, the big inflation.
So what was it like going back to Berlin when you went to go be with your father before he passed away? What was that like going back to Berlin? Did it bring back memories from when you lived there?
Yeah, many memories. As I grew up, I went back and forth to Berlin several times since I came to Arizona, so every 2 to 3 years. But it's always fascinating to see coming back to this big city. It's like the New York City of Germany. If you look at it, there's always something that's new, different. So, but then it's sometimes you go back to that place and then it's like another movie or the previous movie. You were part of that movie. You ride with the subway and you look around saying, yeah, it's like 3 years ago, 5 years, 10 years ago. Not much has changed since childhood, but then you come to a different area saying, oh, something has changed, which is always fascinating for a big city like Berlin. So yeah, I enjoyed going back to Berlin, but that particular visit was to really spend as much time as with my dad because he has also so many stories to tell. Because I knew it's a matter of time, a few weeks or months, that he would pass away and I would not have the chance to see him again.
Let me, if I can ask you another question, what about like when Ronald Reagan said, tear down this wall with Gorbachev? What was that? Do you look back at that and as that being the catalyst?
Yes and no. Because the East Germany at the time in 1989 was basically bankrupt as a country. But it was not just 1989, it started in the early 80s. So there was, the big competition between the US and the Soviet Union, right, with the missiles. So basically, East Germany was bankrupt for many reasons. So they struggled. So they went to West Germany. The politicians went to West Germany asking for big loans so they would survive and so on. But specifically in 1989, you probably know the history very well, right? Early 1989, Hungary opened the border to Austria, cut the fence. So a lot of East Germans thought, oh, I spent some vacation time in Hungary and then, slipped through the border. So that caused already a lot of problems for the ruling party. But then people started to getting really upset with what's going on. And then they went on the street, marched just a few handful of people first, every Friday night, every Monday, forgot, in certain cities. But then it grew over time, became louder and louder, more massive, more forceful, and then had grown over the summer. And so the East German party leaders or the government, they struggled because all people ask for, hey, we want to just travel over there. Let us go. We come back. Don't worry. And they would say, oh, yeah, now you need a visa, you need a passport. And it was back and forth. So there was a massive number of people in the streets protesting, saying, hey, we want a new government, basically. And that escalated until, October 1989, when Gorbachev visited East Germany. There was the 40th anniversary of the country, all of that. And then months later, it was history. So yeah, it was one of the trigger points, the Reagan speech, but it was not really the kicker to bring down the wall, because anyone who says today or in the past saying, I knew that it was time to bring down the wall, no one knew, because it was kind of a coincidence as well.
That's fascinating. Back a couple of years ago, my wife and I, we went on vacation. We went to Kansas City, Missouri, went to the World War I Museum. And my grandfather was a veteran of World War I in the Navy. And they had this ancestry.com where you could go on and look. and I saw some documents from my grandfather in the Navy in 1914 to 1919. He was in the Navy. And I felt when I was looking at those documents, he was 2 years old. I was 2 years old when he passed away. But I remember when I was looking at those documents, I felt like he was like living at that moment. Everything came to life. Did you find that about your grandfather as well? Like when you're reading those diaries?
Oh, yeah. And there's always, every time you reread it again, or read, as I mentioned, I have also the diary of his mother, my great grandmother. So all these pieces together. So as I mentioned earlier, there's also a history of my family. When someone fought in the Spanish Civil War against Franco, became a member of the international brigades. And so there's one, Fritz's sister, actually, she emigrated to the United States in 1928. So there's records of that. And then she met the other guy who then went to Spain. So there's another fascinating whole dimension of family history. Yeah, every time I read the diaries, there's something, oh, wait, I didn't know this. There's a connection, another piece of that you hadn't discovered before.
Yeah, it's like when you see the handwriting, it's like you're actually watching him sign. It blew me away when I saw that. I mean, it's over 100 years ago, and like you have a diary. It just you must go back and forth to it to read it from time to time, even though you wrote the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always go back and read it in the original. So it's just, and it's interesting. You will see when you look at the book, there's a total number of pages is 100 pages. This whole diary. There's some empty pages. I don't know, just probably by coincidence. But then there's 2 pages in there where he has the Russian alphabet, the Russian letters.
Mm-hmm.
He does not say why, and it's all of a sudden 2 pages of maybe he started preparing, returning home. I have no idea. So it's just fascinating how all these little pieces come together, and then all these little stories in the book. And then sometimes it's humor, just very funny things. So if I may share one more story.
Yeah.
Also as a teaser. So the day when they were captured, April 29, and I'm not telling you the name of the small city near Munich where it happened and he writes in a diary, so 2 of my comrades and I, we went to the woods, we buried 80 bottles of schnapps in the woods and some canned meat. And then he says, we'll retrieve it when it's more convenient. Can you imagine? So if there's anyone listening who is a treasure hunter, maybe those 80 bottles of schnapps are still in the woods near Munich somewhere, that little town. So stuff like this, and taking your time, you're going to get captured by the Americans next hour. But hey, let's bury those bottles and we'll get it back when we come back.
That is quite fascinating. This has been quite fascinating. Is there anything else you want to maybe that we may have not covered that you would like to cover? I've just been fascinated by you living in East Berlin, and I had to ask you questions about that. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to cover now?
Yes, I would. So if anyone is listening who knows anyone who would love to turn this into a movie project, I have already reached out to several people. I would love to turn that diary into a movie project. Could be a full-time movie, 90 minutes, 2 hours, or could be a miniseries of some kind. Because I think whoever plays my grandfather in that movie, it could be an Oscar-worthy performance. But not because of that, but I think it's worthwhile portraying his character in a movie, of course, in the context of his life, the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, with all the conflicts and all these episodes. It could be very attractive to wanting to watch it. So if anyone has any connections.
Yes, I don't, but yes, if there's anybody has any connections, and please take care of that. Where can you get your book as well? Where can you get it?
It's the website. That's
okay.
Mind if I hold that one more time?
Go right ahead. Please do.
So if you go to the website, there's a link to Amazon. You can order it on Amazon. Some German bookstores carry it already, but it's the best place to order it from Amazon. There's a link. You can go directly, or you can Google it on Amazon directly. I can hold it up one more time.
Sure, go ahead. Please do. Yes, please do. How old was he? Do you know how old he was on the cover?
The picture's probably taken in 1941. That makes him about 31, 32 years old.
Wow.
Maybe 33, something like this, yeah.
Bernd Haber has been my guest. He is the author, but he also put together the complete diary of his grandfather. Fritz Haber, The Complete Diary, 60 Months in American POW Camp. And Bernd Haber, I want to thank you very much for coming on my podcast. It was very interesting, very insightful, and I got a lot of history from the German side. And I want to thank you very much for coming on my podcast.
Thank you very much, Rob. I really appreciate it.
So that was quite fascinating, just the way you explained it. And 500,000 troops, you must have been looking over your shoulder all the time.
There were certain locations where they were stationed near outside of Berlin. Yeah, I mean, you could tell they're there, yes. If I may give you a little teaser for our next conversation about the Berlin War. So November 9th, it was a Thursday night when the war opened up. I totally missed it. I will tell you next time we talk what happened.
Okay. Well, yes, I'll read it, and I would maybe have you come back in a couple of months after I read it, and we can talk about it and then table that. But I would like to get you back on if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. All right. I'll send you my email address. Is that okay? My home address. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yes.
All right. Well, Bernd, thank you very much. And I apologize for Thursday night, but this was quite awesome. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Rob.
All right. Thank you so much. I'll email you my address. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.